Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
We've seen over recent weeks significant change in the action and in the rhetoric on Ukraine. And Ukraine's action on the battlefield speaks for itself. We, as a nation and as a government, are doubling down on our support for Ukraine and determined to do more.
Determined to do more, says the UK Defence Secretary John Healey, but with Ukraine saying that it has been targeted by an intercontinental ballistic missile, what does determination really mean? Hello, you're listening to Bloomberg UK Politics. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. So it appears to be the first time that Russia has used a missile of this kind in combat since they were developed at the start of the Cold War. It comes after Ukraine used US and UK long-range missiles to attack targets in Russia. These are the ATACMS and Storm Shadow missiles. This has happened after Ukraine's faced months of setbacks in what has become a grinding war that's lasted more than 1,000 days now.
On the ground, Russian casualties appear to be twice as high in this war as they are for Ukraine, but the impact has been catastrophic for Ukraine and to a lesser extent for Russia's economy. In its final days in power, the Biden administration seems to be making a last-ditch attempt to support Kyiv. How desperate will the battle become then in the days ahead?
I mean, no one knows precisely what will happen under President Trump in January. The outcome of the war could determine the lay of the land in a much more fractured and dangerous world. Remember, this is a war on a scale we haven't seen in Europe in many decades, and it involves a nuclear power. So the potential for further escalation comes with massive risks.
Well, joining us on the podcast today to discuss is Bloomberg Opinion columnist Marc Champion and our head of Bloomberg Media Editorial, David Merritt. Welcome to both of you. Marc, can I start with you on the specifics of these missiles? Why are they different to the weapons that have been used so far?
Yes, absolutely. Well, there's a few things about it. The first thing we should say is that nothing has been fully verified. So we don't actually know for sure what was used or what damage was caused. Having said that, if in the run-up to the Ukrainian claim today that an ICBM was used, in the run-up the Russian military bloggers had been talking about the use of a missile that was going to be made, which is it's called the RN-26 or RS-26 or Rubej. And basically, this is a missile that was developed to meet the criteria of an ICBM, which means that it should be able to fly at least 5,500 kilometers. It's a ballistic missile, goes out into space, and then when it comes back in, it travels very fast at speeds of about 5 Mach. And it is extremely difficult to shoot down. So, for example, the Patriot batteries that the Ukrainians have been using to so much effect against cruise missiles and short-range ballistic missiles, they just no use against a ballistic missile. But the other thing to say is that they're designed to carry nuclear warheads, so the messaging is very clear. But in this case, they will have been carrying a conventional explosive, just a larger one than other missiles would have been able to. And a final important thing is that the Russians have very, very few of these. They're extremely expensive. So it's unlikely to be, the kind of escalation which means, from now on, we're going to be using these missiles. They would not strip their nuclear deterrent in that way.
Dave, from where we're sitting here in London, we would be within the 5,000 kilometre range from the site where we believe this missile was fired. What sort of a signal is Russia trying to send to the rest of Europe, the rest of the world, by using a missile like this?
Well, as Marc said, I mean, these are designed in the Cold War to carry nuclear warheads, and as such have been part of the stalemate that the Cold War produced. Mutually assured destruction between nuclear powers meant that nuclear war and conflict never happened. But now we do have a war in Europe. I mean, this comes just after, of course, President Biden allowed Ukraine finally to fire American-made missiles into Russian territory. Then we had the Russians changing their kind of official rules on engagement, such as they are for nuclear wars, saying that action itself would justify it. So this is just another step in that process of ratcheting up tensions, for Russia flexing its capabilities. However, I think it's important to step back a little bit and think, we're still a very long way from Russia actually using a nuclear or device, because the consequences of that, of course, catastrophic for the entire world, but of course catastrophic for Russia itself.
Mark, how much of an escalation do you think this is?
Well, it's the way I would see it. This is going to be a very difficult issue for policymakers in the West to deal with, and that's precisely what it is designed to achieve. So what we have at the moment, as David said, the calculations around whether it makes sense for Putin to deploy a nuclear weapon have not changed. And in fact, he didn't use them when he was losing on the battlefield in Ukraine. He's now winning, and he has a new American president coming to power in a couple of months who wants the kind of ceasefire agreement that Putin thinks he might be able to deal with, because it would favor him. So it's even less likely now that he would use an actual nuclear weapon. That said, it is difficult to parse these things. And, this particular, if it's correct that this was the missile that was used, it's particularly interesting because it is not, technically it's not really an ICBM. It was designed to kind of blur the lines of what was allowed, because at the time, under a 1987 treaty, you weren't allowed to deploy intermediate range missiles. They had to be missiles that would fire at least 5,500 kilometers, because it was understood on both sides that to have the continent of Europe just bristling with missiles that would reach their target in a few minutes was inherently unstable. So it was banned under a treaty. And the Russians developed this missile that when they tested it at above 5,500 kilometers, but with a very, very light payload. With its actual payload, it's a shorter range missile. It's the kind of thing that's designed to hit Russia's neighbors in Western Europe, in Eastern Europe, or indeed Ukraine. And this one, in this case, it flew for around 600 miles. So it's that kind of signaling is also very deliberate. It's saying that we're willing to go, to destabilize in this way, to take risks that Western Europe wouldn't be willing to take. And the real question is whether, I think, in my view, what Putin is trying to do is to shape the debate in the U.S. If he can get President Donald Trump to shape this and say, look, the choice is between nuclear Armageddon, in which you are annihilated, the American people, European people are annihilated, or not giving in to Putin, for a deal that would likely collapse and not favor Ukraine. It's pretty clear what people would choose.
Dave, I wonder, you travel an awful lot in your role. You're back and forth to the United States, but also around Europe as well. Is the message that Vladimir Putin sending going to be heard by a new Donald Trump administration and the outgoing Biden administration? Is this something that actually provokes kind of a different reaction or a shifting of positions from the United States?
I mean, it's certainly being noticed. The Ukraine conflict was an issue in the election in the United States that just concluded. Donald Trump has made a lot of noise about how this wouldn't have happened on his watch, and that he's going to sew this thing up. And of course, the reason we're seeing this flurry of activity, this escalation on both sides, what's changed in the last few weeks is that Donald Trump has been elected. And so the Biden administration finally relented on this very long-standing request from the Ukrainians to use these missiles in Russian territory. And it happened, shortly after that election result. So there's this flurry of activity on both sides. Of course, let's not forget the Russians invited North Korean troops. I mean, we're in uncharted territory here. We have North Korean troops fighting in Europe. We have these reportedly an intercontinental ballistic missile being fired. No one. We are in completely uncharted territory here. So yes, everyone is paying notice across the world. But again, like stepping back a little bit, Putin has threatened escalation with nuclear throughout this conflict. As you said, 1,000 days of it. He was going to escalate things when tanks were deployed. He was going to escalate it at various points. Storm Shadow missiles have reportedly been used in what Putin claims is Russian territory in Crimea. So, all along there's been these threats, but of course they've never actually been carried out. And I think that is the calculation from, say, the British and American governments who have reportedly allowed these missiles to be fired.
On that point of London, what do you think the Starmer government's position is going to be? Staunch defenders of Ukraine for all of this time, and that message was repeated by the Defence Secretary, as you heard. But Number 10's been quite quiet in the last couple of days. They
have been very quiet. I think, our reports show that this presence of North Korean troops was seen by the British government very much as an escalation on the Russian side, which justified them changing the rules. We know that the British government have been lobbying to allow Ukraine to use these missiles in these new ways for some time. We know the Germans have been very opposed, and the Biden administration have been reluctant until now to allow that to happen as well. So the British have always been actually throughout this conflict on the more hawkish side, shall we say, in terms of supporting Ukraine. There's been a lot of stuff in terms of training of Ukrainian troops that has meant that Britain's been one of the the forefront of aid. But of course, everything changes with a changing administration in the United States. If the incoming President Trump is going to pull American support, Britain does not have the resources to go it alone, as it were, in terms of missiles and other aid. So, the British government will be waiting to see what President Trump intends to do after he's inaugurated in January.
Marc, a final thought from you. When we're thinking about all of these changes that are happening in this conflict as well, are we moving towards a conclusion of this conflict? What could that look like?
Well, I think we are. I think it's important actually to listen to what the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has said, which is that he expects for the war to end next year. What he's asking for, even if you look at his victory plan, it has 5 points. Not one of them talks about territory. And there are 4 that are about security, getting security for Ukraine in one way or another so that it can't be attacked again by Russia after a settlement is made. And the last one is actually about resources. These are the public points. There are also classified ones. We are heading towards that. The Ukrainians are in a very difficult position. They are running out of manpower. They are losing territory in a kind of grinding attritional, fight. So we are heading towards some kind of conclusion. What is really happening is that Trump's arrival is, it's concentrating the issue because this is going to come sooner rather than later. And each side wants to make sure that when the music stops there, they are in, a stronger position as they can to get the settlement that they want. And that, I think, is really why things seem to be sort of heating up.
Marc, thank you so much for being with us and for that explanation. Bloomberg Opinion columnist Marc Champion and David Merritt, Bloomberg's head of Bloomberg Media Editorial. Thank you so much for being with us on the podcast. Look, I think this is such an enormous challenge, isn't it? This is the biggest conflict in Europe for decades, since the Balkans. Others compare it to the Second World War. And yet everything is different now with a new US president. What is the UK position going to be after this? I know that the Defence Secretary here in the UK talking about that he won't comment on any of the operational details of this conflict, but that Britain is stepping up support for Ukraine.
Yeah, well, that's it from us for today. If you like the programme, don't forget to subscribe, give it 5 stars wherever you can find it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify or wherever you listen.
This episode was produced by James Wilcock. Our audio engineer was Sean Guastamakia. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. We'll be back with more on Monday. This is Bloomberg.
Bloomberg UK Politics. Listen weekdays at noon on DAB Digital Radio in London.